Inshallah, today I would like to talk about some of the characteristics and the features of a believer or a disbeliever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described in Surah At-Tawbah. So the verses I've been designated is verse 67 and 68 from Surah At-Tawbah, and also verse 71 and 72. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes a comparison between two types and two groups of individuals, two categories of individuals. I've mentioned many times before, and people may have heard this before in many khutbahs and speeches, but I'd just like to repeat a point. And that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has categorized humans into two categories or three categories. Our categorization and the types that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us are not dependent upon our race or our language or our skin color or the regions we are from. Yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us differently with some distinct differences amongst us in terms of our language, in terms of our appearance, in terms of our skin color. However, those differences are not the ones that are considered in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are not the main differences of humans. The main differentiation and categorization of humans are in terms of their ideologies and their beliefs. That's why in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the first 20 verses with this categorization of humans. First, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in 5 verses mentions the characteristics of the God-fearing. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions 2 verses regarding the disbelievers. Then a subcategory of the disbelievers, which are the hypocrites, the munafiqeen. They have been described from verse 7 onwards to verse 20. Then within those 13 verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned 2 types of hypocrites also. 2 types of hypocrites that were prevalent in the time of Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So today, inshallah, we're going to discuss these features or characteristics of believers and disbelievers. Some of these are negative characteristics of people, and some of them are positive characteristics and features of believers. And the reason we have selected these verses is so that we have 2 sides of the spectrum. So we know who is a believer, who is categorized a believer in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and who is a disbeliever. And accordingly, we can assess ourselves to see which category we fall under, because we are the best at assessing ourselves, rather than relying and depending on the assessment of others. Because we will be in our own graves, and we will face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ourselves. Therefore, inshallah, I will focus on these verses of the Quran. First, verse 67 and 68 of Surah At-Tawbah. Surah At-Tawbah, my dear respected brothers and sisters, is a Madani surah, and it's a surah that begins without Bismillah. It has no Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim at the beginning. And no, this ain't the place to discuss whether Bismillah is part of every surah or not. That's a fiqh discussion for another time. However, Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Bara'ah and Surah At-Tawbah was revealed without Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. One of the opinions of the ulama is that this surah was revealed without Bismillah because it's a continuation of Surah Al-Anfal. It's a continuation of Surah Al-Anfal, therefore it has no Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim in it. One of the opinions of the scholars, which is not a very prioritized opinion or an opinion that has much precedence, is that Surah At-Tawbah mentions the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon disbelievers, and that's why it has no Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. However, this doesn't hold much weight, because there's many verses in the Quran which discuss the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon disbelievers. Another opinion is that Surah At-Tawbah begins without Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim because this is how it was revealed. So there's no argument there at all. Or another opinion is it was revealed without Bismillah because this is how it was placed in Mus'haf Uthmani, when it was compiled in the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu. So these are the various reasons why there is no Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim in Surah At-Tawbah. But in Surah At-Tawbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned quite a few ahkam and rulings pertaining to the mushrikeen, the polytheists of Makkah Mukarramah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned some of the verses regarding Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam's hijrah also. Hunayn, the expedition of Hunayn is mentioned in Surah At-Tawbah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extensively mentions the munafiqeen also in this. And it's important to note that nifaq and hypocrisy and munafaqah has been mentioned in the Quran approximately 31 times. in its different forms. Sometimes nifaq, sometimes munafaqah, sometimes munafiqeen in the plural. Sometimes nafaqu, alam tara ila alladhina nafaqu, in the past tense verb, like in Surah Al-Hashr. So this word nifaq has come in the Quran a few times. What are the verses of the Quran? The verse of the Quran, al-munafiquna wal-munafiqatu ba'duhum min ba'd. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the hypocrites, both men and women, proceed from one another. They proceed from one another. They come from one another. That means they are similar to each other. They are alike. They enjoin the wrong and they forbid the right. And they withhold their hands. What are the traits of the munafiqeen? Completely the opposites of a mu'min. What does a mu'min do? He enjoins good and forbids evil. He commands good and he prevents evil. Whereas a munafiq will promote evil and he will stay away from good and he will shun good and he will stop others from doing good. So Allah says, al-munafiquna wal-munafiqat ba'duhum min ba'd. The hypocrites, men and women, they proceed from one another. They enjoin evil and they prevent good. وَيَقْبِضُونَ أَيْدِيَهُمْ, and they withhold their hands, meaning from sadaqah and charity. نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَنَسِيَهُمْ. And this is a good way of not knowing if someone's a munafiq, because we can't make this judgment if somebody is a munafiq or not. But this verse of Quran somewhat relates to the hadith of Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam regarding sadaqah, when he said, as-sadaqah burhan. Sadaqah is evidence and proof of someone's faith. Because if you want to put your money where your mouth is, you got to show the cash, take it out. If you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala truly, take out the cash and give in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in righteous causes. And this ain't a way of me fundraising, so I'm not going to make any fundraising requests right now. Inshallah, we'll have that in Ramadan for this masjid. وَيَقْبِضُونَ أَيْدِيَهُمْ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَنَسِيَهُمْ. They forgot Allah, so Allah forgot them. Now forgetfulness is a quality and trait of humans. Allah doesn't forget. Does Allah forget? Allah doesn't forget. Nothing leaves the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying فَنَسِيَهُمْ? It's a metaphor. When you forget something, what do? You leave it. Right? The munafiqeen forgot, neglected, rejected Allah's commandments. Therefore, they shunned it away and left it aside. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will leave giving them rewards on the day of judgment. So this is a sort of forgetting them too. It's a sort of payback, revenge. You forgot Allah's commandments, I will not reward you. Nasullaha fanasiyahum. Innal munafiqina humul fasiqun. Indeed, the hypocrites, they are the sinners. They are the perverted ones. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the adhab. وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الْمُنَافِقِينَ وَالْمُنَافِقَاتِ وَالْكُفَّارَ نَارَ جَهَنَّمَ خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا. Allah promises the munafiqeen, men or women, and the disbelievers, because nifaq is a subcategory of kufr. نَارَ جَهَنَّمَ. What does Allah promise them? The fire of hell. خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا. Eternity, they will be there for eternity. هِيَ حَسْبُهُمْ. This is sufficient for them. وَلَعَنَهُمُ اللَّهُ. And Allah's curse is upon them in this worldly life too. وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ مُقِيمٌ. And theirs is lasting torment. Now, later on in verse 71 and 72, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the qualities of the believers. And this is an andaz and usloob, and this is a sequence of Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the wicked and the wretched. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the righteous thereafter. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions adhab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will then mention in'am and favor. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions bushra and glad tidings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will then mention inzar and warnings. This is a sequence of the Quran and shows the eloquence and the hikmah and the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inzar, tabshir, warnings, glad tidings. Targheeb, encouragement. Tarheeb, threatening. This is usloob, this is andaz, and this is a method and sequence of the Quran. So in verse 71 and 72, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the opposites of the munafiqeen are the believers. The believing men and believing women, they are protectors and friends of one another. They assist one another in matters of taqwa and piety. يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ They enjoin good, وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ, and they forbid evil, and they establish prayer and offer charity, and they obey Allah and His Rasul. Those are the ones upon whom Allah's mercy will descend. And indeed Allah is mighty and Allah is wise. Allah promises the believing men and believing women gardens under which there will be rivers flowing. They will be there for eternity, and they will have pure dwellings in the gardens of bliss, in the high gardens. وَرِضْوَانُ مِنَ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ. Allah says, do you want something better than that? The ridwan and pleasure of Allah is even better than the Jannah. And this is what we strive to achieve. ذَلِكَ هُوَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. This is eternal success. Now I'm going to inshallah go through some of the vocabulary in this verse just to understand and have a better understanding of what nifaq is. What is nifaq and what is iman? What is ma'ruf? What is munkar? The terms that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses in this verse of Quran. First one, al-munafiqun, the hypocrites. This is plural for nifaq. Munafiqun, munafiqeen, depending on what term, what tense it comes in, is the plural for a munafiq. Somebody who is a munafiq, singular, munafiqeen, a group of hypocrites. This word stems from the root letters nun, fa and qaf, nafaqa. And nafaqa means, depending on what etymological sense it's used, could have several meanings. Imam Raghib Asfahani rahmatullahi alayhi says that it is to enter Sharia from one door and leave from another. So this is what the munafiqeen do. They enter through one door and claim that they're believers, and then they will leave from somewhere else. So the term nafaqa, which means to leave, suits the munafiqeen. It falls onto munafiqeen very well. It fits them perfectly, because they enter Sharia through one door and then they leave another. And even today we have Muslims like this, picking and choosing what they want to follow, right? This is also sort of nifaq, picking and choosing what we want to follow. So it is on the pattern of mufa'ala, munafaqah, mufa'ala. Fisq means to leave, so they are leaving the mercy of Allah or His obedience. That's why at the end of the verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. The munafiqeen and the hypocrites, they are fasiqs. They are perverted ones. What is fisq? Fisq is an open sinner. But literally, fisq means to leave something. And when a person sins, he leaves the obedience of Allah, or he leaves the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then there is another term, fajir, fasiq and fajir. And fajir is somebody who also sins, but he does it openly, expresses it openly, has no fear of it. So there's a difference between a fasiq and a difference between a fajir. Fasiq is somebody who commits a sin, a haram act, a forbidden act. He may do it in seclusion. Fajir is someone who does it in open, and he's not afraid of expressing it either. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from fisq and fujur. So Allah says munafiqeen, they are the fasiqeen. Another term Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses in this verse, يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمُنْكَرِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمَعْرُوفِ. The munafiqeen, they enjoin upon evil. Munkar. What is munkar? Munkar is an act that sound minds, good minds. Sound minds, not the mind of anyone, but sound minds consider evil, or something that the Sharia has prohibited. And all acts of disobedience fall under the category of munkar. And ma'ruf is something that the sound mind considers good, or Sharia has considered good, or shows us it's good. This word has been used in many different contexts in the Quran, ma'ruf. I'm not going to go too much into the terminologies and vocabularies, because we inshallah want to spend more time explaining nifaq in Islamic terms and perspective. Mu'minun is the plural for believers. Whoever believes in the articles of faith is a mu'min. And awliya, another term Allah uses, al-mu'minun, mu'minat, ba'duhum awliya'u ba'd. Believing men and believing women, they are protectors and friends of one another. So wali is somebody who is extremely close to you. Somebody who is extremely close, but it also has a connotation of trust involved. Khalil is also a friend. Sadiq is also a friend. But a wali is somebody who's a very close associate, and you also have trust in them. Allahu waliyyul ladhina amanu. Allah is the wali and protector of the believers. So that means we trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have this closeness with Allah, and we also trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, what is hypocrisy and who are the munafiqeen? When we discuss nifaq and hypocrisy in Islamic terms, who is a hypocrite and what is hypocrisy? What is hypocrisy? What's the definition in Sharia, the technical definition of hypocrisy? And who are the munafiqeen? What's their historical how did they emerge, and how were they historically placed in the advent of Islam? First of all, nifaq, and the definition of nifaq is anybody who is a false pretender can be called a munafiq. Somebody who pretends to be something that they are not. He is a munafiq. To feel what one does not feel, and a false assumption of goodness and piety. These are all definitions of nifaq and hypocrisy. Now, how did the munafiqeen actually emerge in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam emerged as a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first in Makkah Mukarramah. Immediately he encountered idol worshippers and idolaters. In Makkah Mukarramah, Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam invited people towards the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we know the trials and tribulations Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam faced, the torture and persecution, due to which he was driven out of Makkah Mukarramah. Medina Munawwara received Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam with open hands. However, there were different communities residing in Medina Munawwara. From those communities, one of the dominant communities was the Jewish community. They were residing in Medina Munawwara. And they were placed in Medina Munawwara initially because they were awaiting the final prophet themselves. Then why didn't they believe in Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? They believed in him, they didn't want to accept him because of hasad. In fact, the Quran says, الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابِ يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. Those whom we gave the book, they recognized him like they recognize their own children. When a person sees his child, he has no doubt, this is my child. He sees the features, he sees everything, he says the resemblance is there. That's my child, I have no doubt whatsoever. When it came to Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam's face, they knew also that he resembles exactly the description we find in the Torah. That's why when Abdullah bin Salam radiallahu anhu saw Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, مَا هَذَا وَجْهُ كَذَّابٍ. This isn't the face of a liar. This is a truthful man. So the Jewish community was residing in Medina Munawwara, but another community that was residing in Medina Munawwara is also the idolaters that were there in Makkah Mukarramah too. Now, there was one man, Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul, who was known as a leader amongst the people before Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam migrated. He was noble and people respected him. And before Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam's arrival to Medina Munawwara, Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul was going to be crowned as Prince of Medina. And we know how hungry people are for power. I don't need to go into the hunger that exists amongst people for power and position. Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul was one of those. He liked power, he liked the position, he liked the authority. He liked to be under the limelight. Like many people like to be under the limelight today. Celebrities too. They really love the paparazzi. They don't hate the paparazzi. They love them. They act like they don't like the paparazzi, but they love the paparazzi. That's how they gain publicity and fame. So Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul was the Ra'isul Munafiqeen. He was about to be crowned as Prince of Medina. However, Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam migrates and the limelight is stolen from him. Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't mean to do that. He wasn't a man who liked the limelight. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him Sayyidu Wuldi Adam, the leader of the children of Adam. And he says, Ana Sayyidu Wuldi Adam wala fakhr. I am the leader of the children of Adam and I have no pride. However, this stole the limelight and Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam became kind of a barrier for Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul to reach his pinnacle and to reach the top. Therefore, together with some of the Yahud, Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul tried to defeat Islam from within. They conspired, they met, they plotted and planned. How can we defeat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his mission? And the best way to do this is from within. If you have an enemy within your ranks, he will cause more harm to you than an outsider. An outsider will come to you and he will say, yeah, I hate you, come on, let's go. And he will start his fight or his whatever trouble he wants to make. But an insider, he will know all your weaknesses, he will know all your strengths, and he will plan and plot against you from inside, from within. And he will topple you over. So Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul, together with some of the other people, they formed this third group, this third alliance, and they were known as the Munafiqeen and the hypocrites. So the appearance of Munafiqeen and their emergence came in the Medina Munawwara. This was the first place where the emergence of Munafiqeen came. Now, the munafiqeen were always exposed in the time of Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Why? Because Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was receiving revelation, wahi. And wahi and revelation will always expose the actions of the munafiqeen. So we find out about the munafiqeen and their decisions and some of their statements in many verses of the Quran. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also revealed the whole surah, Suratul Munafiqeen, regarding them. And we also find that in the battles they wouldn't take place because they didn't want to give up their luxuries. They didn't really want to die. They didn't really believe in Islam. They claimed to be believers, but they were not really believers. And we also find in Hudaybiyah, when Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the Sahaba left Medina Munawwara to perform the Umrah, they didn't leave with Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Even though Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was going for Umrah, they were afraid that if we leave, there may be a fight. Because the Meccans ain't going to let them enter that easily. There will be some resistance. And in the resistance, there will be some casualties. So they didn't want to leave. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished them in a different way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said the following year, when the Muslims do go for Umrah, only those people will go. Actually, no, not just for that. Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Khaybar after that, Khaybar took place after that, the battle of Khaybar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said only those people will go for Khaybar who went for Hudaybiyah, because in Khaybar there were going to be a lot of spoils of war that were going to be achieved and received by the Muslims. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said only those people who went for Hudaybiyah, they will go for Khaybar. So basically this is how the munafiqeen were. They were all, Rasulullah was always one step ahead of the munafiqeen. He was always one step ahead because he was always informed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and verses of the Quran were always revealed exposing their actions, their plots and their plans. So Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was always very well informed about their actions, to the extent that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also gave Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam a list of those who were munafiq. Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had this list, and there was one Sahabi radiallahu anhu, Hudhayfah ibn al-Yaman. Hudhayfah ibn al-Yaman radiallahu anhu, he was the keeper of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's secrets, Sahibu Sirri Rasulillahi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had given this list to Hudhayfah ibn al-Yaman. And Umar radiallahu anhu would always be afraid. And this is the mark of a mu'min. He doesn't rest on his laurels. The mu'min doesn't rest on his laurels. He is always afraid. Umar radiallahu anhu used to say to Hudhayfah, is my name on that list? Can you please check if my name's on that list? And Umar radiallahu anhu would watch out for the janazah to see if Hudhayfah is present or not. Because there's no janazah on a munafiq. We have to treat a munafiq like we'll treat another Muslim, because we don't know. Allah knows he's a munafiq. In an Islamic court of law, he will be treated like other Muslims will be. Only Allah knows if a person is munafiq or not. But Umar radiallahu anhu would watch out for Hudhayfah ibn al-Yaman, because he had that list. So he knew for sure if somebody is a munafiq or not, because Rasulullah had given him that list. So if Hudhayfah is present in a janazah, Umar radiallahu anhu knows that this person is a believer. If he's not present, then he knows this person is a munafiq. So Umar radiallahu anhu used to ask for this always in the time of, he used to ask Hudhayfah ibn al-Yaman. Now, the hypocrites in the time of Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam were people who claimed to be believers on the outside, but inside they were kafir, they were disbelievers, they hated Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and they wanted to defeat Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and Muslims at all times. Now, as I already mentioned previously, that nifaq is a subcategory of kufr. So the question arises, who is more dangerous, a kafir or munafiq? The answer is apparent and obvious. A kafir will openly express his enmity or his disregard or his disagreement with you. And he may even come against you, and he may even come and fight you. Not all kafirs, we're speaking about specifically in the time of Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. They openly expressed their hatred, and they marched upon Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam many times. However, the munafiqeen didn't openly express their hatred, and they were working from within. They were informing the mushrikeen of the plans of Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. They were trying to do this. So they were more dangerous, because they were aware of the weaknesses and strengths. So they are always going to be more dangerous than a kafir would be. And a munafiq is worse off than a kafir because he lives two different lives. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, the hypocrites will be in the deepest pits of fire. إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ مِنَ النَّارِ. وَلَن تَجِدَ لَهُمْ نَصِيرًا, and you will not find any helper for them. This verse shows and teaches and indicates that their punishment in the hereafter will be more severe than the average disbeliever. Then a question arises, are munafiqeen still existing today? Do we still find munafiqeen today present in Muslim communities or infiltrating our masajid? Well, they might be informants. Allah knows best about that. We can't discuss that right now. However, are munafiqeen existing today? The way to tell a munafiq is two ways. Either he is exposed by revelation and wahi, but today nobody is receiving wahi. And if they are claiming to receive wahi, they are liars. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ended wahi with Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The Quran was the final wahi Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent. Anybody who claims he receives revelation without taking names, he is a liar. The second way of knowing if a person, if munafiqeen are existing today, is if a person clothes him or herself with the same traits and qualities that the munafiqeen had in the time of Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So there are certain traits, certain habits, certain qualities and features that the munafiqeen had in the time of Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. If a person has those traits in him today, then he is assimilating with the munafiqeen. He has some sort of nifaq in him. And also today, there is a type of nifaq that is existing, which is known as ilhad and zandaqa, heresy and ilhad. Ilhad is when a person misinterprets a verse of Quran or denies and distorts one of the orders of Islam. And we find many of those today in the Muslim Ummah. Many of those. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said salah is farad, then they will say, oh, salah, there's a different meaning for it. Allah has said zakah is farad. So they say, oh, zakah just means to purify. So as long as I purify myself, I'm fine. I don't have to spend money. Or if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said something else is farad, or Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said something is farad, then they will say, oh, we deny the hadith. Hadith has no authority. Na'udhu billah. So you will get this type of people today, and they fall under the category of mulhid and zindiq, a heretic or a person who denies or distorts the image of Islam or one of the faridah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is ilhad and zindiq. Someone who distorts one of the symbols of Islam, makes fun of dhabah, which is one of the ways dhabah is a symbol of Islam, makes fun of hijab, which is a symbol of Islam, makes fun of adhan, which is a sha'air of Islam, one of the symbols of Islam. So anybody who does anything like this, he's known as a mulhid, he's known as a zindiq. So he's a heretic and he is denying or distorting one of the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the hypocrites in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about, they had certain traits. Like I mentioned earlier, 31 times nifaq comes in the Quran. In the first 20 verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designated 13 verses discussing the munafiqeen. Allah says also regarding them that they assume they are deceiving Allah. يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. First Allah says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَقُولُ آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَبِالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَمَا هُمْ بِمُؤْمِنِينَ. From people there are those who say that we believe in Allah on the last day, but they are not believers. They claim they are deceiving Allah and the believers. وَمَا يَخْدَعُونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسَهُمْ وَمَا يَشْعُرُونَ. But they are not deceiving anyone but themselves. Allah says in their hearts there is sickness, and Allah will extend that sickness, and they will have a tormenting punishment due to their lies. Allah then says, لا تفسدوا في الأرض قالوا إنما نحن مصلحون. This is nifaq. Allah says, don't cause corruption on earth. They say, we are only well-wishers and reformers. This is nifaq. A false conscience of righteousness and goodness. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to them, believe like the believers, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. They brought iman, believe like them. So they call them idiots. This is also, na'udhu billah, one of their traits. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ اشْتَرَوُا الضَّلَالَةَ بِالْهُدَى. They are the ones who have exchanged guidance for misguidance. فَمَا رَبِحَتْ تِجَارَتُهُمْ. Allah says that their transaction is not fruitful, is not beneficial. وَمَا كَانُوا مُهْتَدِينَ. They will not be guided. Allah then describes two categories of hypocrites. Firm hypocrites and shaky hypocrites. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that there are some hypocrites that are firm. They don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at all and they don't care about it. And then there are some, they're on the edge. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى حَرْفٍ. They worship Allah on the edge. When there's good times, they will be there. When there's bad times like jihad, they'll run away. Oh, I can't put up with this. I can't handle this. Hajj is too hard for me. So we have this amongst Muslims today as well. So these are the two types of hypocrites. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes them with two different verses, two different examples in Surah Al-Baqarah. I'm not going to go through these examples because we don't have much time. Then there are two other types of hypocrites that the ulama mentioned. One is a hypocrite in faith and one is hypocrite in action. Hypocrite in faith is somebody who says, I'm a believer, but inside he is not. That sort of hypocrite does not exist today that much. We don't know about their existence today. Then we have a second type of hypocrite who is one who is a hypocrite in action. And what are the traits of those munafiqeen? Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, Ayatul munafiqi thalath. The signs of a hypocrite are three. When he speaks, he tells a lie. When he makes a promise, he breaks it. وَإِذَا اؤْتُمِنَ خَانَ. When he is entrusted with something, he breaches that trust. Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, if you have one of those traits, you're 1/3 munafiq. If you have two of them, you're 2/3 munafiq. And if you have all three of those traits, then you are a complete munafiq. Allama Khattabi rahmatullah alayhi says that a person who has the traits of a munafiq as described in this hadith is a munafiq in action, and if not in faith. And some scholars say that if a person persists on those traits, then he will also eventually fall into the first category, where he will be a munafiq in action too. The punishment for the hypocrites Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in various verses of the Quran, and the reasons for hypocrisy. Well, kufr is the first reason for hypocrisy. Weak faith, a lack of confidence, when one lacks security, because they were insecure. The munafiqeen were insecure. They didn't know about the hereafter. They didn't have faith in it, conviction. So they were munafiq for that reason. And selfishness, like Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul. Now, promoting evil was one of their main traits. يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمُنْكَرِ. They didn't like goodness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this. So in this verse, Allah describes one of their traits, which is stopping good and promoting evil. Holding their hands back from charity. And there's a hadith regarding promotion of evil that states that whoever starts an evil act and gives custom to it, its burden will be upon him. He will get the sin for everybody who does that. Allah protects us from that. Now, the comparison. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'm going to have to summarize this in a nutshell, 5 minutes, inshallah, I only have for this. I've already been given warnings. So, qualities of the believers in verse 71 and 72, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, exactly the opposite of the munafiqeen. The believers are friends and associates of one another. They complete one another and they protect one another. يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. And this is a very important duty in Islam. Enjoining good and forbidding evil. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Ali Imran, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. They must exist amongst you a group who invites towards goodness. They order good and they forbid evil. And they have firm faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. They will be the successful ones. That verse in Surah Ali Imran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a very significant thing. Before that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, adopt taqwa. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, hold on tightly to Allah's rope. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the point of unity amongst you should be the Quran. The rope of Allah is the Quran. Hold on firmly to Allah's rope. How will you hold on firmly to Allah's rope? If there exists amongst you a group of people who will continuously invite towards good, enjoin good and forbid evil. Then you will hold on firmly to Allah's rope. Otherwise, if this obligation and this darurah, this need is not taken responsibility of, then there will be sin prevailing in the ummah. So it's essential that the ummah takes responsibility to enjoin good and forbid evil. We learned this same thing in Surah Al-Asr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, indeed mankind is in loss except those who bring faith and perform righteous deeds. That's individual. I've done that. If a person says, I've done that, I've brought faith and I've performed righteous deeds, that's just half the job. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. And he enjoins and advises haqq and truth, and he enjoins and advises sabr. That's the second half of the job. So a person takes care of himself individually, then thinks about the society around him. We also learn from another verse of Surah Ali Imran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. You are the best of people who have been taken out for the people. Allah sent you for other people. this ummah of Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ta'muruna bil ma'ruf. Why? Because you encourage good. وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ, and you prevent evil, and you have firm faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then we also learn from other verses of the Quran or hadith of Tirmidhi in Ibn Majah. Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, by he in whose hands is my soul. If you stop, Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, by he in whose hands is my soul, continue to enjoin upon good and forbid from evil. Otherwise, a time will come where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish you. And this is what we found in the previous Ummam. كَانُوا لَا يَتَنَاهَوْنَ عَن مُنْكَرٍ فَعَلُوهُ. Their rabbis and their priests and the people in authority and leadership didn't prevent people from sin. They saw it happening, they didn't stop it. They didn't prevent it. So they were punished by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In another hadith, Rasulullah says, وَإِذَا تَرَكَتِ الْأَمْرَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَالنَّهِي عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ حُرِمَتْ بَرَكَةَ الْوَحِيِّ. When this ummah stops doing amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi anil munkar, preventing evil and enjoining upon good, when the ummah stops doing this, they will be deprived from the barakah of wahi. They will be deprived from the Quran. They will be deprived from revelation. In Surah Ma'idah, Allah subhanahu the famous hadith, Rasulullah says, religion is sincerity. Religion is good advice. The Sahaba asked for whom? Rasulullah said, for the general masses. List of people, then Rasulullah said for the general masses, which means you take care of have their good concerns at heart. If we see an evil take place, we stop it and we encourage good. In the hadith, Nabi Kareem says, "Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadihi." Whoever amongst you sees bad happening, try and stop it with his hands. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. If he cannot do so with his hands, then at least with his tongue, say something. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِقَلْبِهِ. And if he cannot do that also, then at least with his heart, think bad about it. ذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ. That is the weakest of faith. We hear in another hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered one angel to go and destroy a village. When he went, he saw one person there who is doing dhikr of Allah. Everybody else was sinning and he was doing dhikr of Allah. He came back to Allah and said, "Oh Allah, how can I punish these people when there is one of your servants there doing your dhikr, who has not even disobeyed you to the extent of one blink?" لَا يَعْصِيكَ طَرْفَةَ عَيْنٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, go back, lift that qawm and village and throw them on his head. He is doing dhikr of Allah, but he's not preventing the evil around him, because that's his duty. So from this verse of Quran we learn that it's an individual duty of every Muslim that they must prevent evil and enjoin upon good. Now there is different categories, because according to a person's capability he will do this. And another thing a person will have to look out for when doing amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi al munkar is he has to have knowledge of it. If a person doesn't have knowledge and he goes out and does amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi al munkar, how will he guide the people? How will he teach the people? First of all. Secondly, there is no fear of backlash or severe backlash. So if you go into a place in East Texas somewhere and there's a bunch of, for lack of better terms, I'm not going to use any bad words, there's a bunch of people there whom we will know what we're talking about. Or a person goes to Arkansas somewhere where there's lots of Ku Klux Klan, or he goes to Idaho and there's the Aryans there, and he starts to openly just express his beliefs in Islam, they're going to beat the hell out of you. Sahaba did this and they will be rewarded for it, but we're not required to do it. You are not required to do something in a dangerous situation like that. So there are two conditions for this amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi al munkar. You have to have knowledge of it. Secondly, there is no fear of severe backlash. Also, there's some methods of doing this. If it's something farad, we have to tell people. If somebody's not praying, we have to tell them, pray. If it's something mustahab, like just to pray nafil or reciting Quran, then we could just say to them nicely, you should read Quran too. When you're advising somebody about something which is not farad, use a very soft approach. And if it's about something farad, first use a soft approach. If they don't take heed, then you can use a harsher approach. So parents can say to their children, pray salah beta, pray salah. If he doesn't take heed, then they can say, pray salah, with a more harsh tone, more harsh approach. That can only be for faraid. not for mustahab acts. Another ruling is that preventing evil will only take place if it's happening in front of your eyes, because Rasulullah says, whoever sees an evil, stop it. If you know about somebody who is sinning, we can't prevent it if it's not happening in front of our eyes. That's not our duty. We will have to take this case forward to those who are responsible parties. And my very respected elders, this is not just an individual responsibility, it's a responsibility of the entire community to prevent evil and enjoin upon good. In fact, in an Islamic mamlaka, there is a group who goes about doing this, and there has to be a group amongst the community doing this at all times. يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the present tense verb. A present tense verb Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses, that they will continuously invite people towards khair. Continuously. So they will always be involved in this. And the precondition is that they have to have knowledge. They have to have knowledge, and they have some more authority in doing this. And khair and goodness is all of the sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is khair and goodness that they will invite towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, inviting towards goodness has two stages. Let me just very quickly summarize this. One is inviting non-Muslims towards Islam. That is also our responsibility and duty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِينَ إِن مَّكَّنَّاهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ أَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتَوُا الزَّكَاةَ وَأَمَرُوا بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَنَهَوْا عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ. Those that we have placed on the earth, if we've given you power on the earth, you establish the prayer and you offer charity, and they invite towards good, they order good and they forbid evil. So that is our duty also, to invite non-Muslims. And the second one is to just show Muslims as well the guidance, give them guidance towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to enjoin good amongst them and forbid them from evil too. And this was upheld by the companions of Nabi Kareem sallallahu alayhi wasallam very well. And also part of this is that amongst the Muslim ummah there has to be a group who stays behind. Even in time of Rasulullah, when expeditions used to take place, a group used to stay behind so they can gain knowledge of the Quran, knowledge of the Sunnah, and then they can propagate it in front of people, into people, and they can do amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi anil munkar correctly. فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ طَائِفَةٌ لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُمْ إِذَا رَجَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَحْذَرُونَ. Even at the time of Rasulullah, when jihad used to take place, not everybody left. A group would stay behind so they can focus on the Quran, Sunnah and studies, so that Islamic knowledge can be preserved, and then they can teach the others when they come back. So this, my dear respected brothers and sisters, is the traits of believers. Amr bil ma'ruf, nahi anil munkar. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says they establish the prayer. Mu'mineen and mu'minat, they are protectors for one another because they enjoin good, forbid evil. They advise one another. And they establish prayers, they offer charity, obey Allah and His Rasul. Those people will have Allah's mercy, and they will be in paradise and gardens under which there will be rivers flowing, and they will be in very blessed dwellings in the highest of Jannah. And the greatest thing they will receive is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أُحِلَّ عَلَيْكُمْ رِضْوَانِي فَلَا أَسْخَطُ عَلَيْكُمْ بَعْدَهُ أَبَدًا. I have descended my ridwan upon you, my pleasure. I will never be angry on you after this day. This is the greatest certificate somebody can achieve. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the tawfiq. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.